I will try to avoid making references to politics today, although let me confide in you, it's gonna be very difficult because Uri Zvi Greenberg is indeed a very ideological poet with very set opinions about who is friend and who is foe and how things should be handled. So I will really try to navigate that today without bringing it all the way to today. But if it happens, it happens. It's not the end of the world, and we will, as always, treat each other politely. Let me just say one word of I do hope and pray unnecessary warning, but I'm going to say that in the last 72 hours, sirens happen in Tel Aviv often. Should that happen, you will hear it through my mic and you will know that I will need to go to the Merchav Mugan. So I want you to know that, and we will decide how we are handling it, depending when it happens, if it happens, at what part of the shiur it is. If it is at the very beginning, I suggest you stay there and I come back 10 minutes later as the a prescription or the suggestion goes. If it's towards the end of the class, I suggest we conclude the class should that happen. I hope it does not, but I just want for us to be sort of on the same page on that one. And now, having said all that, welcome again, everybody. Wonderful to see you. And I start, as always, with the classical round. We concluded Leah Goldberg last time, and I said a few words about the way we are going to start with Uri Zvi Greenberg. But if anybody had a comment, a question, an insight since last time that they would like to share with us, this would be a great moment to do that. So just let me know if indeed that is the case. If there is anybody who has a comment or a question since last time. If you do not, and I do not see any raised hand, let me put the screen, the PowerPoint on, and so we can get started. So as you can see, I opted to put a painted portrait of Uri Zvi Greenberg because he had become indeed such a legendary figure in Israeli poetry. And I will say a few words about his place in that larger map or larger scope of Hebrew. And in the case of Uri Zvi Greenberg, you should slash Yiddish poets of the 20th century. And indeed, that is what he is. In the sessions, I don't think, when I first planned and did that, it was planned for 2 sessions. So I called the first one Prophecies. But it is our custom in my Pardes sessions not to rush and to take things easily. So I'm not thinking that we are going to deal with all 4 poems that are here. And I'm not rushing to do that. I had to do that in another framework. I'm just suggesting the larger title that I gave to this group of poems that Uri Zvi Greenberg writes all the way to the beginning of World War II. I took it to 1937, but one of the things that you will find out as soon as I suggest the timeline for Uri Greenberg, that he is silent poetically. He does not publish during the years of World War II. It's the very famous Uri Zvi Greenberg silence that is oftentimes referred to. I did not say he was not writing. I want to emphasize that he was not publishing. He was writing. And then we have immediately afterwards the abundance of Holocaust-related poetry of Uri Zvi Greenberg, for which indeed he is most famous. So today I call this Prophecies because these are poems that he had written before looking at the situation of Jews worldwide and Jews in Eretz Israel, and Uri Zvi Greenberg saw himself as a prophet, and we will discuss the term that he used to talk about himself, Hatzofeh lebet Yehuda, the onlooker, the seer of the house of Judah. He actually called his poetry that. And let me start by suggesting a timeline. So I put the years 1896, which is when he is born in Galicia, and 1988 is when he dies in Eretz Israel. Mind you, you would expect a person like Uri Zvi Greenberg to have lived in Yerushalayim. It is not the case. He had lived in Tel Aviv. Okay, so 1988. And in between, so in the years 1915 and 1918, he participates as a soldier in World War I, while at the time already he is sending poems to be published. And when the first book appears, it gets his military unit, and actually his commander hands him the copy of his first book of poetry that had arrived to the trenches. So he serves under the flag of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, fighting against the Serbians. In his case, I just want to add that I had a grandfather who fought and got killed under the same flag of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there is a moment, a point in my own personal story that connects to this experience indeed very well. Immediately following the war, he will go to first Warsaw, then to Berlin to study. I want for us to note the name Berlin because that will coincide with many other poets that we have looked at. Bialik was in Berlin. Chernyakhovsky was in Germany more than once. Agnon, of course, lived in Germany between the two world wars. So Berlin is not a coincidence. After the fall, no, I should phrase this differently. After the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution, the Hebrew poetry, the Hebrew literature, the Hebrew language center, which was in Odessa, falls to pieces, and they start traveling. And many will go to America, and many will, no, not many, but quite a few will come to Eretz Israel. And many will go to Germany, and specifically to Berlin and to its suburbs. So you could meet there, of course, the locals such as Buber, but also the newcomers from Galicia, Uri Zvi Greenberg, from Galicia, Agnon, from the Ukraine, Bialik, etc. They gather in Germany. It is a liberal, free country at the time. Leah Goldberg will have her PhD in Germany at the time. And I could continue on and on and on. So when I put names like Warsaw and Berlin, those are significant. Those mean something. The Alterman family is in Warsaw at the time. His Aliyah comes in 1923 as well at the end. So in between World War I and 1923, he is studying. Upon Aliyah, he comes as an Ole. If you look at the dates, these are the dates of the end of the third Aliyah, the beginning of the fourth. And Uri Zvi Greenberg comes, the third Aliyah is way, way more socialist even than the second Aliyah. These are the people who thought that even a settled kibbutz was too bourgeois. And they had just these, moving around groups and camps who paved the roads in Eretz Israel and who started new settlements and moved on because holding on to property was too bourgeois for them. And he comes among these people, and he is an out-and-out socialist. He will be called upon to publish his poems in the first issue of Davar, the Mapai Labor Party daily paper in which Alterman acquires his fame later. Uri Zvi Greenberg is totally affiliated with socialist pioneers, socialist Zionism until. And that is the moment, the Hebron massacre, 1929, where he totally cuts himself off. Liberal, socialist, Zionism, and moves to Beitar, to the Jabotinsky people, and he will be their spokesman as of that moment. So Uri Zvi Greenberg chooses right-wing Zionist ideology and becomes its core and center and main poet, I would say, such as Alterman is to the labor movement, Uri Zvi Greenberg is to the Cherut, Beitar, etc. I'd like to say a word about how one speaks about Uri Zvi Greenberg and my choice to continue to say Uri Zvi Greenberg, because if you belong to right-wing Israel, to Beitar type Zionism, to Cherut, etc., and Uri Zvi Greenberg is your poet. He is the person who articulates the ideology of revisionist Zionism. You would normally address him as Uri Zvi, as a familiar way of addressing, as the labor movement will speak about Rachel only by first name, etc. I do not belong to that part of Israeli ideology, and therefore I don't take the liberty to call Uri Zvi by this sort of more intimate way of addressing. Geula Cohen, whenever she spoke about Uri Zvi Greenberg, she said Uri Zvi, and that was enough. I do not have the chutzpah to say that. I come from the other group. So I will continue to address him as Uri Zvi Greenberg. The murder of Arlozorov, the assassination of Arlozorov, which takes place in 1933, will even more deepen the divide between labor Zionism, who will accuse members of the revisionist Zionist movement of having assassinated Arlozorov, a thing that was never proved to this day, but it's still a moment there where Uri Zvi Greenberg will take sides. Okay, the Arab riots, so we have the 29 Hebron massacre and the riots around it, and we come to the Arab riots of 1936-37. I want them on our board because I will start placing the publication of the different poems according to this timeline, and therefore I want them to be present here. World War II, I don't need to explain. State of Israel comes into being. The first Knesset, Uri Zvi Greenberg, is a member of the Knesset for Cherut. He is not the only poet who had served on the Knesset, not the only writer. There were quite a few. Okay, Six-Day War will bring, of course, the revelation of the beginning of the, I would say, some people will call it messianic in a derogatory way. I think for Uri Zvi Greenberg, the word messianic is anything but derogatory, so I will use it in his connection. Obviously, he will be at the head of the movement for Greater Israel, Tnoah Eretz Yisrael Shlema, sitting smack there at the center of the podium as they announce the creation of this movement, and sitting next to him is none other but Natan Alterman. So the Six-Day War brings a change in ideology to Natan Alterman that had happened to Uri Zvi Greenberg in 29, which is interesting to know. And he, of course, serves under Likud government, writes under Likud government, and so he lived to see the day that labor governments are replaced by Likud governments in Israel, which of course is marked in his writing at the time. Not very many years of that period he had. He had also disappointments. He was very disappointed that Moshe Dayan at the time, under the unified government, allows the Muslim authorities to be in charge of Temple Mount. Did I tell you how difficult it would be not to be political today? But one of the poems of Uri Zvi Greenberg deals with his disappointment of not maintaining ownership and control over Temple Mount. So it manages to seep into our days today. Let us place the poetry along the timeline of history. I put in red a work called The Book of Accusation and Faith, Iliot V'Koach, and because some of the poems we study today come of that book, which is very important. And then here is the famous silence throughout the years of World War II that I addressed myself to earlier. And here are the later poems, the center of which is River Streets. This is an awkward translation of the Hebrew name, Rechovot HaNahar. When we come to it, either next week or the one after that, I will explain the title. So this is more or less what we are looking at. Obviously, if you open even a limited source as Wikipedia, and there are more detailed ones, you will find many, many, many more details about the life and writing of Uri Zvi Greenberg. But I wanted for you to have this picture in front of you, and then I'm adding two elements, and that is to see who his contemporaries are. I normally put Natan Alterman and Leah Goldberg together when I do a timeline because there is a very small discrepancy. He was born in 1910, she was born in 1911, and both of them pass away in 1970. So I put them together on one timeline, and you can see that Bialik, of course, is a contemporary and an admirer of Uri Zvi Greenberg in his latter years, Bialik. Natan Alterman and Leah Goldberg are practically, contemporaries. They are all in Eretz Israel. They all came from over there. None of them is Israeli born, neither Bialik, of course, nor Leah Goldberg, nor Natan Alterman. They all have in their biographies Zionism from an early age, Ivrit before they ever come to the land of Israel, Yiddish at their background, not Leah Goldberg, but for sure Bialik and Natan Alterman. And it's good to see how these amazing cultural heroes, I would say, of the period that we call Meshorerei Eretz Israel and not Meshorerei Israel, because they come here and do a lot and most of their work at the time of Eretz Israel before the state. I'd like to leave this on for a moment just for you to check out and see if you should have any questions or you would like me to elaborate on a given element of this timeline. I also am saying that if any of you would like to have a copy of this, since when I taught this in my other poetry classes, I was asked to prepare just a one sheet, a copy of this. I can easily email it to you if you can use it to your teaching, for your studying, to share with other people. It's not a problem. So let me give you another few seconds to check this out, and I'll be pulling out of it just to see if there are any comments or questions or people who need any further details just about the timeline. Yes, please, Judy, just don't forget to unmute. Yeah.
What were the politics of those contemporaries?
Ben-Gurion, Ben-Gurion, Ben-Gurion.
Ah.
Okay. Among the major poets of the time who lean more towards the revisionist side is Chernyshkovsky. Is Yitzhak Shalev, the father of the novelist Meir Shalev, okay? It's not that Uri Zvi Greenberg is alone, but he is a giant on that side of the ideological continuum, okay? But you know what? I should add Yitzhak Shalev just to make it more balanced ideologically. Thank you for the question. I will. Okay, anybody else? Okay, yalla, it's time to do some poetry. So I started by using the word prophecy even as the subtitle of my sessions today, and I want to start with this. So Uri Zvi Greenberg had published a book called B'Malhot Hatzlav in Malchus von Salem. He wrote it in Yiddish. And there was, at the time when this is published, a tendency, not very, very common, but a few did it, and that is to publish poetry in a way that the print shape represents an idea out of the poetry. So in this case, you can see, just notice the Yiddish side on the left-hand side. You will see first on the top line, even if you can just decipher the Hebrew letters, can you see something that I address myself to? The inner language, the inner codes, Uri Zvi, no Greenberg. Uri Zvi, just like Rachel, just like Zelda. There was a thing when a poet acquired a certain place, position, that an intimacy is connected to his name, so Uri Zvi. And then from Salem, Inri are the initials, of Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That is over the image of Jesus, oftentimes in churches. And you can see that the poem is indeed printed in the shape of a cross. I'm going to ask for a reader and somebody who can read from the screen if you did not have time to print out or to look at the text that I sent you. If there is anybody who is comfortable reading from the screen, and I will repeat a remark that I have said before the class. The works of Uri Zvi Greenberg in most cases are extremely long. So I'm giving you excerpts, and sometimes we only study excerpts of the excerpts. But this one, I want to read everything that is on the screen. So just let me know if anyone can see it clearly enough so that they can read. Yeah, please go ahead, Judy.
A black dense wood has grown out of the flatlands, such deep valleys of grief and horror within Europe. The treetops ache, wild with darkness in wild dark. The dead are hanged from their branches and their wounds still bleed. The heavenly dead all have faces of silver, and the moons anoint the brain with such golden oil. And when any shriek with pain, their voice is a stone in water, and the prayers the bodies raise are but tears into the deep. I am the owl, the mourner bird in the grief woods of Europe, in the valleys of grief and terror, in purblind midnights beneath the crosses.
Judy, will you stop for a moment? What we want to remember from this verse, first of all, you saw that very dreary, problematic image of catastrophe pending. And then it's only in the second verse, the second stanza, that the poet introduces himself. Who is the voice you're listening to? I will tell you, me, the owl. And he takes the position of the night bird, the owl, which can see clear when everybody else's view is limited by the dark. Mine is not, says Uri Greenberg. Just take that as our opening remark as he sees himself. You are limited by the darkness. I am not. I am the owl. Let's continue.
I want to raise a brother's plea to the Arab peoples of Asia. Come and deliver us out to the desert, lowly though we be. But mine is a sheepish flock, in terror as the half moon swings down like a scythe against our throats. So I cry out pointlessly in terror, I, the world-wounded heart in Europe. And in the grief wood, the sheep lies down with throat outstretched. And I, world wound in Europe, I spit my blood upon the cross. Tremble, you old and young, tremble with watery heads in the grief woods. These 2 millennia, a silence has burned in the deep beneath the trees, such a poison collecting in the abyss, and I don't even know what the matter is. 2,000 years of bleeding and silence, and not one mouth has spat the poison spittle from its gums. Books there are in which the Goyim's murders have been written, but our answer is unwritten there, our answers to the murders. So big these grief woods have grown, and the treetops are all aching, wild with darkness. What terror when the moon peers down. And when any shrieks of pain, their voice is a stone in water, and the bleeding of the slain is like dewdrops into the ocean.
Thank you.
Great
Okay.
Europe,
Great
kingdom of the
Europe,
cross. Yeah.
kingdom of the cross. The Malhot from Salem. Remember, this is written in Yiddish. This is why I did not read the original to you, although, of course, I brought it here so that you know that we have the Ivrit. I'd like to pull out another short excerpt of later on in this poem, in the Crucifix Kingdom by Uri Zvi Greenberg, which I did not find in translation. So I'm not sure if this is mine or somebody else's. So just in case you see mistake, remember that it can possibly be mine because it was not included in the translation that I found. I'd like to read this one. Yet I speak to you a prophecy, a black prophecy. From our valleys, a pillar of cloud will rise. From our dark breath, the bitter cries of pain. Yet you will not perceive the horror in your bodies. The chatter will continue from your burning palates. Jews, Jews. As poison gas begins to seep into the palaces, and suddenly the icons scream in Yiddish. No one is left standing. Shepherds lie stiff by trees, and rainbow colors glaze their eyes. The stables burn, the sheep bleat madly. It blazes higher. From all sides of people carry wood to the pyre. A little silver cross craves fire, fire. So you could now all stop me and say, Rachel, hang on for a minute. Did you not say a few minutes ago that you are going to deal with Uri Zvi Greenberg's Holocaust poetry later? Why are you putting this here? And here is my answer. This is when this book was published. Just look at the date I put on the screenshot of the cover page, 1923. This is not even saying that it's before the rise of the Nazis to power that will come 10 years later. This is just as maybe the beginning of some Nazi ideology is starting in Germany, maybe in fascist Italy. But, you know, and yes, he is in Berlin in those years. Does he see that which nobody else sees already? And the idea of dying by gas? Like, where is this coming from? Practically 20 years before the gas chambers. So it's, as they say in French, pour cause, for a good reason, that I entitled this chapter of our learning of Uri Zvi Greenberg's poetry as prophecies. And there is no denying, he is not the totally only one. And at this point, when he is writing this, he is not affiliated with right-wing nationalist ideology. But I will have to say that the other person speaking very early about the need to evacuate Europe because of an impending disaster is Jabotinsky. The idea of evacuation of Europe because of an impending I'll come to you in a minute, Matt. Okay, just a minute. Let me just conclude the sentence. So I for sure can recognize this element of, if you do not want to call it prophecy because it makes you uncomfortable, because prophets are only in biblical time, I'm fine with that. But an extreme sensitivity of poets who are able, and this is why I stop you, Judy, for the image of the owl, because the owl does not claim prophecy. It's not a metaphor of a prophet. It's a metaphor of a creature that is granted the ability to see in a situation where other creatures' sight is impeded by dark. I'm being extremely modest because Uri Zvi Greenberg, yes, he said, I will talk to you prophecy in this poem, but it's the prophecy of the owl, the creature who can see in the dark. Matt, your turn.
Okay, thank you. Uh, there's something here that's leaping out at me. I mean, it's talking about 2 millennia. He's talking about a Christian Europe. He's talking about crusades. He's talking about persecution of the Jews. He's got in here my brother's plea to the Arab people of Asia. Come and rescue me. My people are sheep. This might have nothing to do with any kind of prophecy about the Holocaust. This is about help us survive or get out of Europe or whatever, but it's not because of Nazism. It's because this is a kingdom of the cross.
Okay, so first of all, although Nazism is for sure not embedded with Christian ideas, but there is a connection between Christianity and Nazism. I don't want to go there. I spent quite some time of my life studying this. There is a connection, but you cannot talk of Nazism in 1923 yet. But you can talk of anti-Semitism in Europe that is growing following World War I, that is taking insignia and symbols that are not foreign to the cross. About that you can talk. What is interesting, and I really applaud you for picking on that, Matt, is the call for Arabia. The innocent belief at the time that if we went out of Europe and went to the east, where is the kingdom not of Christian but of Arabs, we will be able to be rescued in that kingdom. Did I say already how difficult it will be to talk about this disconnected from today's events? Very difficult. But this is the belief, which he will change after 29. So 6 years later, after living already in Eretz Israel and seeing the massacre in Hebron, and the riots in 21 all over 29 all over the country, also in 21, by the way, he will change sides and will not seek rescue neither from the Arabs nor from the Christian and their local representatives, the Brits. By the time he makes Aliyah to Eretz Israel, it's already British Mandate Palestine. It's not the Ottomans anymore. Even by the time this poem is written, it's not the Ottomans anymore. It's 1923. Okay. And thank you for that comment, Matt. Anybody else on this first encounter with an Uri Zvi Greenberg voice? Because I wonder how many of you knew his poetry before we started. How many of you are familiar with his work? Okay, not a lot is translated, but there's quite enough, and then I sent you quite enough. Okay, Esther, you are muted. Is that for a reason? Did you want to say anything or ask anything?
No, I did want to say, but Matt said it very, really
Okay.
for me.
Okay, yeah, that can happen in a class. All right, let's go back therefore to the class and continue from where we had stopped. And this is indeed in Malhot from Salem. So I'm totally with Matt. The language is about 2,000 years of Christian persecution of the Jews. And I, world round in Europe, I spit my blood upon the cross. This is what happens. We Jews, our blood is all over the cross for all these millennia silenced and burned. Yet, however, although I was shying away from the word prophecy, and so were you, Matt, the mentioning of killing by gas, like seriously, how evident is that in the 2 millennia of Christian persecution? Not so much. And so there is something, there is a sensitivity. By the way, affinity and fear of killing gas would be the outcome of World War I, of course, where all sort of poison gas was used in the fighting. So it's not foreign to the post-World War I world or atmosphere to speak about gas. So let's put aside the decision whether Uri Zvi Greenberg was or was not a prophet and agree to go with the fact that he is extremely sensitive to the potential of the realities around him. And I think with that, we can all go. Okay, I'd like you to start by looking at the right-hand side of our screen. And these are just a few excerpts of the newspapers of the time, after which Uri Zvi Greenberg will switch ideological sides. And one of the important poems that he writes at the time, Be'oznei Yeled Asapera, here it is, Be'oznei Yeled Asaper. I can tell you that the son of Uri Zvi Greenberg, who oftentimes leads tours in the old city and to Har HaBayit when that is possible, he always, upon the entrance to Har HaBayit, and there is a clip, there's a video clip on YouTube that you can find only in Ivrit, of course. He stops with the people he's guiding through the tour, and he will read to them this particular poem, Be'oznei Yeled Asapera. It has the structure of an old tale, not exactly the structure of ballads poetically, but the storytelling is a ballad-like. So I would like to do a little bit of the Ivrit. It's a long one, but again, this is one of the average length poems by Uri Zvi Greenberg. Many are much longer, that I would like to work our way through. There is an imaginary poetic situation, and that is oftentimes the case in poetry, when the poet would like to establish who is the speaker and who is or who are the addressees. So when he says in Ivrit, Be'oznei Yeled Asaper, I shall tell it to a child's ear or ears, there is a very clear statement. I'm not talking to you, Chevre. I'm not publishing this as a newspaper for an adult readership. I lost faith in you. I don't trust you anymore. I need an innocent listener. This is a story I want to tell to a child of our days. Remember that as this great poet is switching along the ideological continuum of the time, there must be quite a number of bad-mouthing, of critique, of people going like on the local newspapers and such, how could you, or Tzvi, etc., don't you, why don't you, etc. Yet there is the pain following the Hebron massacre, so maybe many understand. Let me be 100% clear about the following. In spite of Uri Zvi Greenberg's move to the right-hand side of the ideological continuum, the one person, not the one, but one of the people who will remain a total admirer of his work will be David Ben-Gurion. And David Ben-Gurion, he knows that he had lost Uri Zvi to his camp, to his side, yet he has greatness enough in him to know the greatness of this poet. Bialik the same, does not agree with him ideologically. The switch happens few years after Bialik makes Aliyah. Bialik arrives to Eretz Israel in 24, a year after Uri Zvi, mind you. When the switch happens after Hebron in 29, Bialik is still within the labor camp. He will continue to make people listen to Uri Zvi. And when people tell him, but how can you? He's talking, about walls and symbols, etc. And Bialik uses the metaphor. He says he's talking about walls because he's the only one who can see what is behind the wall. So listen to Uri Zvi. So Bialik too, in his metaphor, does not use the owl in speaking about Uri Zvi, but his ability to see where other people's sight is limited. And this is the one I will continue to work with as we go. So this is something that Bialik had said about this poem when people on the left-hand side were objecting to it. Enough said. I'm continuing to seek a reader. Judy, are you good to continue?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So let me do a little bit of Ivrit. So remember, he is not addressing the real audience. He is hiding behind telling a story to a child. ילד עברי, בביתי בציון המשפלת, ערב דמדום אני שח ואתה לברכי. לך חביבי אספר את סיפור המעשה במשיח הטוב שלא בא. לגדולים פה ממך לא אספר, חביבי, לגדולים אין עיניים כאלה, ויקר שכזה אשר בעיניך. גדולים לא יקשיבו כמוך, אטמם מאוד הגורל בציון, ונפשם משולה למנורת כלי חרס בכפר, ויגונם לא יזרח בשתי דמעות נפלאות כאשר בעיניך. This is as far as we go now with the English. Judy, will you read it for us?
Hebrew child, in my home in humiliated Zion, evening twilight, I speak while you are on my knees. To you, my beloved, I will tell the story of the God Mashiach who never came. I will not tell it to those older than you, my beloved. The grown-ups do not have such eyes and such preciousness as in your eyes. Grown-ups will not listen like you. The fate of Zion blocked them, and their soul is like a village clay lamp. Their sadness does not shine like your forehead when I tell you the tale of the Mashiach's disaster.
Okay. First of all, there is a mistake. It's not God Mashiach, it should be good Mashiach. And this is absolutely my translation. So just pick up mistakes as you go. Obviously, I read and reread, and then mistakes will happen. So listen very carefully, because the same metaphor reappears time and again in Uri Zvi Greenberg's poetry. I choose to speak to the child. Why? לגדולים פה ממך לא אספר חביבי, לגדולים אין עיניים. I will not tell it to those older than you, my beloved. The grown-ups do not have such eyes and such preciousness as in your eyes. Constantly linked to a precious, unique ability to see that some others do not possess. This time, it's not the poet's persona in the poem who has the particular ability to see, it's the listener. Children are innocent enough, they therefore see better. Their eyes are not impacted as the adults. Grown-up will not listen like you. The fate of Zion blocked them, and their soul is like a village clay lamp. So something of the big light, the big enthusiasm is lost. Look also at the opening. Hebrew child, in my home in humiliated Zion. And again, this word is extremely important. The year is 1929. Zion HaMushpelet, humiliated Zion, is following the Hebron and the other massacres in the holy cities in Eretz Israel. And the sense is all the work we are doing here as Zionists is not justifying any pride or any belief in our strengths. What had now happened is humiliating. Now again, avoiding the present, I want you to listen on your own to Hebron massacre references in the media in the last 48 hours. Okay, just listen. It's there all the time. This was a moment, a divide in the Yishuv. It was a moment of divide among the pioneers, among the Chalutzim, as how to understand what had happened. Was it just an obstacle, or was it a life-changing event in understanding that I am not seeking anymore help from the Arabs, as in the previous 1923 Berlin poem, I'm somewhere else, and I need to educate. This is the purpose of the poem, of the structure. A new generation that will understand better. Lead us a few more lines ahead. I will stop you when I am ready. Will you, Judy?
He did not come, the Mashiach. He flew like an eagle over the blood abysses. I could hear the sound of his wings day and night. He reached the coast of Jaffa in a man's shape with a backpack on his shoulder, a wretched pauper, a man of vision, a man of sword. He was so close. He was here. I could hear his blood bubble like wine bubbles into a glass. I heard him hop from hill to hill, his footsteps like a deer and an ibex on every high rock. Later, I recognized him in the plowman walking under the scorching sun and in the mason hewing Jerusalem flint. But to the top of Temple Mount, he never came. This is the only mountain his feet never touched. He reached only the entrance, just to the threshold of the kingdom. There the peddlers found him with burning, glorious moth, and with a mane of burning rays around his skull. The fire key to the temple gates in his hand, just like Mashiach's law. They welcomed him there with their mocking, cheating Hebrew language, the peddlers.
Toda rabba. This is where we stopped. And indeed, give me just a moment because I need to highlight something for you. Okay. We now have these three highlights. I'm educating the next generation. And as he tells the story of the Mashiach that almost made it, he could see him in Jaffa like a peddler, but ready to make Aliyah, okay? Backpack on his shoulder. And he could also see him later among the people who build the land. Could we read this as a recognition of an earlier belief, maybe, that indeed those agricultural Zionists, the new immigrants that you could meet in Jaffa, that you could meet among the builders in the cities, that you could meet in the valley, Emek Israel, plowing the fields, etc., were indeed messianic performances, as one would believe being a member of the third Aliyah. But comes the but. So he was so close, he was here, I could hear him, etc. Footsteps, Pa'amei Mashiach. It's really the language of a Zionist Tzionut Datit, okay? The beginning of Zionism are the footsteps of Mashiach, Pa'amei Mashiach. Recognized him in the plowman, etc. Now comes the but. To the top of Temple Mount, he never came. This is the only mountain his feet never touched. He reached only the entrance. And what stopped him there? Just a highlight. They welcomed him there with their mocking, cheating Hebrew language, the peddlers. The Hebrew language, obviously, is the language of the new immigrants, of the Zionist pioneers. And Uri Zvi Greenberg of this poem, following 1929, is calling it cheating Hebrew. You pretend it's not true Zionism. You did not include Temple, Yerushalayim, Mashiach in your dreams. Building Tel Aviv and the kibbutzim was your main goal. Cheating, not the true faith. This indeed is the poem where you can see the switch. I could see Mashiach in the plowman. I don't anymore. Something was missing. This is the voice indeed of Cherut. This is the voice indeed that Uri Zvi Greenberg will create for this type of Zionism. Let's continue. What did they say to him?
What did they say to him then? I heard what they said. You are wrong, wanderer. In every generation, there is such a one who is wrong, who sees a false vision, Jerusalem's kingdom. Ha ha. And in every generation, we stand here on the threshold to teach wisdom to the erring visionaries. Jerusalem needs a rich uncle, a bag of cash to build houses, to trade, to eat, and to drink. With no temple of God on the hill, and without a throne for our King David, and no signs for the heroes. Jerusalem needs a golden calf, and not the image of Bar Giora, wretched pauper, a man of vision, a man of sword. Jerusalem needs silence and gold and silence. It is not so bad the British ruler is on the city walls. It is not bad that the Arab is on the top of the hill and we are in the valley. Did you get it, wanderer?
Okay. Can you hear the ideological criticism? What Uri Zvi Greenberg now has to say about mainstream Zionism at the time. Let me pull out for a minute because this indeed may call for some of your reactions. The mainstream Zionist movement headed by Ben-Gurion, headed by labor Zionism, they are the majority, traded the true faith for comfort. Compromises. The British are our rulers. That's fine. We can make do. We don't need to fight for sovereignty. The Arabs are on this fortress, on top of that hill. La la la. We will find a way of living with them. Uri Zvi Greenberg is now at another place. So he puts in the mouth of his metaphorical people or guardians of the gates to Temple Mount, who do not let Mashiach go on because he needs to be stopped, because in every generation there is such a visionary and we know better. What we need is compromise. What we need is agreements. What we need is what can be achieved right now. That's fine enough. The greater visions we do not want. For the fifth time today, very hard to keep this away from what is happening as we are living these days. And yet, do you dare make a comment or ask a question? Go ahead, Esther.
I just wanted to talk about Rav Kook,
Uh-huh.
who did see the agricultural workers and praised them as being part of what was happening. And so you don't have the confrontation of the religious spiritualism. Rav Kook came before the state, I think he passed away before. Rav Kook.
But Uri Zvi Greenberg also was there, and this is written.
I'm trying to say something very positive in how Rav Kook saw all the secular Zionists in a very positive light.
Esther, this is 100% true. We are not in the conversation between secular and Rav Kook Zionism. I can find you poems about that. We are now in a conversation between left wing and right wing. And left wing being mainstream Zionism, let's speak clearly, Ben-Gurion, who will see compromise, who will see settle with the Brits, settle with all sorts of agreements. Zionism and the right wing wants the full image, the Harabait, the Messianic, the total sovereignty, etc. This is the language. Uri Zvi Greenberg also belonged to the people who admired the agriculturals. He comes from there.
Yes, but Rav Kook, it's really part of his ideology.
I know that. I know that.
He crossed the line because he was a messianic.
True.
What do you call? So he crossed the line. He saw the good in all this, and maybe Tzvi Uri Greenberg left it and was disappointed.
I'm trying. I'll try again to explain this. We are not at odds. I do not argue with you about the position of Rav Kook with all its subtlety. What I want for you to sort of give me a hand and let me lead you there. Uri Zvi Greenberg doesn't say that Rav Kook is wrong. Uri Greenberg doesn't say that working the land is wrong. He says it's not enough. It's not enough. You need to aspire higher. And I don't think that Rav Kook would have opposed that.
No, definitely not.
Okay. All right. So this is where we are at. I'll keep you, Matt, to see if there is somebody else, because I think I saw another hand. Jean, did you raise your hand earlier? No, you did not. So we are going to you, Matt.
Okay, I think what he's associating, you talking about right wing, it helped me when you answered Esther, because you associated him with right versus left, but not religious right, just right. Like a Jabotinsky.
I don't get this. Are you talking to me?
No, I'm just. I was just saying when Raquel answered you, I figured out something. I think I'm just looking for confirmation that there's a difference here between the religious right, as the Satma that don't say the Mashiach didn't come yet, forget it, we got no business here, and the like revisionist right or the Zionist right that says we belong here is just not. It's just not enough yet. This isn't Mashiach. We just belong here. This is our land.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So indeed, we are walking. You're absolutely right, Matt. We are walking between subtleties. Let me sort of diverge for a moment. About a week ago yesterday, I interviewed for another organization the writer Meir Shalev. And Meir Shalev comes from a revisionist family, went all the other way, okay? Just did the other switch as Uri Greenberg. After the 6-Day War, he goes into very liberal left-wing Zionism. All are Zionists, by the way. And he is the son of Yitzhak Shalev, a revisionist poet who is unbelievably angry and writes a poem in 48 after the Jewish quarter is abandoned in Yerushalayim, and says, you had the power for Negba, you had the power to push back the Egyptians, and that the old city you didn't have the power for. How could you let that be? This is the home in which Meir Shalev grows up, okay? And so I started the interview by, juxtaposition this position by putting his father's poem and a poem that he had written after 67, which criticizes this approach. And I asked him to address it. He said, Rachel, you think I opposed my father in my writing? I opposed Uri Zvi Greenberg. He is the one that influenced my father. This was the language spoken at home. And in my title of the poem, B'Shem HaNe'arim, in the name of the young lads, I was continuing a conversation with Uri Zvi Greenberg. I wanted to speak for the young boys who were educated that way and didn't want to fight anymore. So what is interesting to see is that how the ideological contrasts are all standing on the shoulders of the same biblical writers, on the same classical Jewish writers, drawing their metaphors from that, using the metaphor of Mashiach for their own purposes, of what does Mashiach represent, what does Temple Mount represent, what is Beit HaMikdash. When Meir Shalev started his conversation, he said, in my life, there are two holy cities, Yerushalayim and Nahalal. Nahalal, the capital of Zionist pioneering settlement in the beginning of the 20th century. And these are the two holy shrines, and I live between them. So we are actually circling in this field, if you wish. And I think it's not such a bad hike to pick up on that. But if there are no more comments and Judy is still good, yes, go ahead, Judy, unmute, please.
It's fascinating to me that these icons of Israeli poetry can so dramatically switch their ideology, and yet they're still followed by their fans. You know, their ideology can turn completely 180 degrees, and yet they remain iconic writers and beloved writers in spite of it. It's
You could interview
fascinating.
me on that because I obviously did not follow Nathan Alterman into his switch of ideology in 67. And yet I have a class that I teach poetry in Hebrew that I started on the first weeks of the pandemic and never stopped but for Chagim and Moadim. And we are doing nothing but Alterman for 14 months now, every week. And we love every moment of it. And most of the people participating, I think, are not so far away from my way of ideological thinking, and yet we admire Alterman. Ben Gurion never shied away from Uri Zvi Greenberg. Uri Zvi Greenberg always could publish in Devar, and Bill will accept it, the editor-in-chief. We have changed since. This is one of the things we have lost, the ability to publish Uri Zvi Greenberg in Devar as a metaphor. Okay, let us go back to our screen and read some more poetry for today. Okay, so we left here, and where did we stop? Do you remember, Judy?
I think it is not so bad. It is not bad that the Arab is on top of the hill and we're in the valley.
Mm-hmm. So
did you get it, wanderer? And when they finished talking, they laughed. Ha ha, the Mashiach is contorted as if cut by a knife. I was contorted as well, as if cut by a knife.
So this is still the story, why the Mashiach never made it. It is not so bad the British ruler is on the city walls. These are all the compromises of, mainstream labor movement at the time, Histadrut, Ben Gurion and such. It is not bad that the Arab is on top of the hill. What do you mean not bad? Look at what happened in Hebron, okay? How can you still believe it? Why do you not understand my switch in sides? And we are going to continue a little bit with this poem. As I had warned you, it is long. Can you continue, Judy, or shall I ask for another reader? I could.
If somebody else wants to read, I'm happy to.
Okay, Jean, how do you feel about reading today?
Okay.
All right. Had they assaulted
him with a knife and pierced his heart, he would rise with a knife in his heart over their bodies. But since they pierced him with derision, they overcame him. The peddlers, and I heard him asking with a blood-full mouth, and where are the generations that had waited my coming? Those who called for me from Rome, from the gate of Titus, are to the threshold of the kingdom. And I heard him conclude, the generations are not with me. Woe to me, woe. And woe to you, my land, both sides of the Jordan. The Mashiach turned away. Where to, I know not. I know not the story. I know not the storyteller.
Okay, let's stop here because I don't know if I highlighted it. No, I did not. But here it is in the line that you just read, and I heard him conclude, the generations are not with me. Woe to me, woe, and woe to you, my land, both sides of the Jordan. Can you hear Cherut language? שתי גדות לירדן, זאת שלנו, זאת גם כן. The Jordan has two banks. This one is ours, and so is the other one. And this is the poetry arising from the Uri Zvi Greenberg language. This is what will lead the creation of the movement for Greater Israel. And by the way, when Nomi Shemer, also from a labor Zionist background, joins the movement for Greater Israel, and she is interviewed about her feelings being there in the camp. She expresses a total disappointment. What is her disappointment? That the movement for Greater Israel never spoke about the other bank of the Jordan, as they should have. That Eretz Israel Hashlema, what do you mean Shlema, she said. How can it be whole if it's only the west bank of River Jordan? So when they speak, Uri Zvi Greenberg here and other ideological followers about all of it, what does the all include for Mashiach to come? Because Mashiach, obviously, the idea is the whole, the all. So Uri Zvi Greenberg says the all. It's Temple Mount, it's freedom and sovereignty, it's the two banks of River Jordan. So now you know what's at stake. Now he told you what he is going to educate the young generation for. Let's continue a little bit. And woe to you, my land, both sides of the Jordan. Yeah.
The Mashiach turned away. Where to, I know not. I know not, the storyteller. Perhaps he is the jackal howling here in the vineyards of Canaan. Perhaps he went alone to the most solitary of the world's strongholds, to the Masada fortress. There he is sitting with no garment. The sweltering heat burns in him, his body so stiff. He is sitting. An assembly of flies are licking the bleeding. He is sitting. And the night commends the Arava winds to rise from the salty Dead Sea and blow their nostrils on the wounds of the strange man who is sitting. Perhaps not. Perhaps he did enter and is sitting.
Okay, let's stop here. Now we are thank you. Now we are speculating on where Mashiach is. And two images are important for us to mark in case you didn't get both. First of all, Mashiach is in mourning. Yoshev, 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 he is sitting. He's in Shiva. He's in mourning, sitting, Yoshev Shiva. The other thing is, and we take this for granted, but we shouldn't when this is written in the 20th. We need to remember that the importance of the Masada story, the Masada event, the Masada myth, wherever you are ideologically as per that event, starts becoming prevalent in those years. There are three, maybe more, leading spiritual voices who will make that happen. Uri Zvi Greenberg is one. The Mashiach will retreat to that point of loss, out of which will come the cry in the Yitzhak Lamdan poem of Masada, Shenit Metzada lo tipol, Masada will not fall again. And while these poets are busy reviving the story of Masada, rather die or slave become, that is the message of Masada. He calls all these others peddlers because they settle for less than perfect. There is Shmaria Gutman, the teacher who will start leading Tiyulim to Metzada. And this will become the thing for the youth movements. In the 30s, Masada as the opposing metaphor against the Hebron massacre. We know how to behave. We know what heroism is. So these are all here apparent, but let's go to the other option. So when he went to the stronghold, and now we come to the other one, perhaps not, perhaps he did enter. And can you still continue a little bit, Joan?
Yes, perhaps not. Perhaps he did enter and is sitting in the edges, scolding, furiously groaning like a lion Dibbuk. I am telling no one about his hiding place in the edges, and I feed him fresh meat and give him blood much better than wine to drink. And I am playing for him with great depth the cello, lamentations and supplications and prayers of my ancestors. And when the moon rises like a prophecy among the olive trees, I am playing for him with great depth the harp. She is beautiful, your eternal Jerusalem, in the glorious moon, just like in the nights of the David's kingdom. And generations of Israelites wrapped in talitot, a frightening light on their heads. I see them waiting for the rear guard, until a delicate shuddering trembles in my thighs, my cheeks and my temples are hollow, and heat in my eyes, and he in the edges is weeping. Perhaps not. Perhaps it was he who rose in the shape of an eagle
Okay.
over.
Hang on. So now, after we had the Mashiach at Metzadah, we now have the Mashiach in hiding. I am his keeper. I with the owl eyes, I the storyteller. Maybe you don't know that about me. I know the secret of where Mashiach is. I'm keeping the secret, and I am sort of taking care of him, cuddling, feeding, mind you, with blood, playing music, reminding him of the beauty of Yerushalayim, a little bit the lore of the captives in Babylon, you know, singing there about the beauty of Yerushalayim. I will do that. This is my obligation. I have to maintain, to make sure that the image of Mashiach is not lost, that it is there. He is there to rise strong and full of belief when the day comes. Okay, so again, he is adopting for himself an additional role, the keeper of the messianic idea. Let's continue and conclude this page.
Perhaps not. Perhaps it was he who rose in the shape of an eagle over Kidron Valley and flew circling Temple Mount and crying. I saw his circling and heard him crying. It was then I said, a weeping bird. Isn't this the end of all expectations? The farewell circle, the closure? Israel's messianism in the shape of a bird is taking leave of Temple Mount. The eagle concluded its circling and flew to the sea. It flew, noiseless, winged. Everything was so dark. Perhaps just Titus's city returning to the arch there.
Let's conclude. Just this last piece that I put on the screen. Again, an unseen
body chained for 2,000 years, heading deep into the bloody Hebrew well. As is Mashiach's law, again for 2,000 years, who knows if not, humiliated.
Humiliated Jerusalem,
1930.
This is the place where he is writing from. So maybe he hangs on to the heroic image of Masada. Maybe he is kept by writers like me. Maybe he left and we have to wait 2,000 years more. We thought that we were living Messianic times. We thought that the Zionist movement was the footsteps of Mashiach. I don't think so anymore. Maybe we need to wait. And then what kills you, of course, is just like the opening line, humiliated Zion. He is in Yerushalayim at this time in his life, and this is how he signs his address. Yerushalayim hamushpelet, humiliated Yerushalayim. I think it's important for us to note the strengths, the depth of feelings, the anger, the pain, the despair in 1930 when this is published, because our generation is the one that associates Jewish thinking about disaster that is something that is always somehow connected to the Holocaust. And it is important for us to note that prior to World War II, such deep feelings of horror and pain and devastation could be handled. And by the way, Uri Zvi Greenberg is not alone. Remember Bialik after Kishinev. See him after Hebron, and in a totally different way, but still very strong, the impact of the War of Independence on Amichai, who did not experience the Shoah because the family comes to Eretz Israel prior to the Shoah, and yet the pain and the losses of friends and the horror of fighting and battle of the War of Independence is his kind of trauma and horror to live through. So this is one of the things that we want to acknowledge about Uri Zvi Greenberg, because he is so known for his post-Shoah poetry that with this depth of feeling and what I offered to call earlier sensitivity, if you don't want prophecy, to really feel the pain of what the massacre in Hebron, the helplessness, the humiliation had brought such a change into his life and a total commitment now to fighting for never being thus humiliated. I, of course, will take your comments and reactions if you have any to this. I don't see any hand raised, so let us try and do one more before we are ready to conclude this class today. Okay, now, in the history of Hebrew poetry, I should say, and not only Israeli poetry, there are some poems that are important in their own right, and we will start looking at One Truth, Not Two, and thank God there is a good translation, and I did not need to translate that. It's so hard to find enough translations of Uri Zvi Greenberg, and I'm so pained when my very limited ability to translate has to be used and exercised because I cannot find better translations. But where was I taking you? In the history of Hebrew poetry, there are a few poems that acquired such a place that they are used in political argument. And when that happens, they will be quoted in the Knesset, in speeches. So obviously there are 2 or 3 very famous Altermans quoted by both right and left wing, mind you, when it serves whatever the speech is about. And this one truth, not two, the person who brought this into the Knesset is Geula Cohen, Zichrona Livracha, the very famous Chirut party, a member, and then the parties that emerged out of that, not Likud. And she oftentimes, when the conversation will go into, you need to be nuanced, you need to be able to entertain other opinions, this is what democracy is all about, etc. And when she and others from the Likud or from Chirut wanted to stress, yes, but there are certain values upon which you cannot compromise, then they will go back to this basic text, Emet Achat Velo Shtayim, from this book of Kitrug Ve'emunah, Sefer Ha'iliot Ve'akoach, that you want to be familiar with. This is like knowing Silver Platter by Alterman, okay? This is like a basic text if you belong to a right-wing Israel, but even if not, you want to be familiar with these, I would say, cornerstones texts. So I will read a little bit of the Hebrew. You will see that the tone is very, very different. Unlike Be'oznei Yeled Asaper, I will tell it to a child's ear, which adopts the tone of legend, the tone of ancient ballads, maybe the tone of even lamentation. This one is almost like an Alterman of the 7th column, addressing the events of the day, speaking in everyday language, and let us listen. This is the great orator, You could hear, if you were not in Israel at the time where Uri Zvi Greenberg was still speaking in public in this tone, I would say that oftentimes listening to Begin is a very good semblance to this tone of the oratorial ideologist. So I'm just checking. Jean, will you continue? Shall I go back to Judy?
I don't mind. I can continue.
Okay, so let me do a little bit of the עברית. אמת אחת ולא שתיים. רבותיכם לימדו ארץ בכסף נקנית. קונים את הניר ותוקעים בו מאדיר, ואנוכי אומר, אין ארץ בכסף נקנית. ובמאדר גם חופרים וקוברים את המת. ואנוכי אומר, ארץ נכבשת בדם. ורק הנכבשת בדם מקודשת לעם קדושת הדם. ורק ההולך אחרי התותח בשדה, זוכה כן ללכת אחרי מחרשתו הטובה, על זה השדה שנכבש. Let's do the English.
Your rabbis taught a land is bought with money. You buy the land and work it with a hoe. And I say a land is not bought with money. And with a hoe you also dig and bury the dead. And I say a land is conquered with blood. And only when conquered with blood is hallowed to the people, with the holiness of the blood. And only one who follows after the cannon in the field thus wins the right to follow after his good plow on this, the field that was conquered.
בבקשה. You cannot be more straightforward than that in your ideology. Uri Zvi Greenberg sees the wheeling, dealing, buying, arranging, reaching all sort of It will never happen like this. We will have to own the land through fighting, through our blood, and only if we do that, we will be able to enjoy tranquility. Let me do another stanza. רבותיכם לימדו המשיח יבוא בדורות הבאים ויהודה תקום בלי אש ובלי דם. היא תקום עם כל עץ, עם כל בית נוסף, ואנוכי אומר, אם דורכם יפגר ולא ידחק בידיו ודפקה ותקץ, ובאש לא יבוא עם מגן של דוד, ובדם לא תבואנה ארכובות סוסיו, לא יבוא המשיח בדור גם רחוק, לא תקום יהודה. English, please.
And only such a field gives nourishing and healthy bread. And the house which arises on its hill is truly a fortress and a temple, because in this field there is honorable blood. Your rabbis taught the Mashiach will come in future generations, and Judea will arise without fire and without blood. It will arise with every tree, with every additional house. And I say, if your generation will be slow and will not grasp in its hands and forcibly mold its future, and in fire will not come with the shield of David, and in blood will not come with its horses saddled, the Mashiach will not come, even in a far-off generation. Judea will not arise.
Okay, so now, and this is good for us to conclude upon maybe, he is taking on more than Ben Gurion. Now he's taking on thinkers, Jewish thinkers, such as Buber, who will say, you know, the Mashiach is an idea. It will come if we work hard. It will come if we, persist in our ways, etc. Not the real thing. And he says, no, Mashiach is what Mashiach is, that it needs to be pushed for and not compromised upon and not waited for and not sold cheap down the road, because if you do that, he will never come. So actually, although the tone is very different, we can see him struggling with the notion of what Mashiach means. From the story he tells a child to a speech he is making from the paper or in the marketplace, wherever, standing on. This is what you were taught. Think again. It's not true. It doesn't work that way. I'm bringing you now a new belief, which is ancient, but you need not to compromise anymore, but go straight forward with strength, with blood, with force, with true belief. Let's talk here. We'll come back to One Truth, Not Two, Emet Achat Velo Shtayim. I actually admire this poem, and I always enjoyed hearing Yehuda Cohen quote it by heart, as I can quote any Altman. I cannot quote this, but she could. And it was admirable to me how on the different spots of where we are ideologically in Israel, we always have a great poet to quote the truth that we believe in.